Fantasy films have been a part of cinema since its inception, but the horror movie genre can arguably be said to have been created in the early years of the sound era. Since that time, thousands of horror movies have been made in Hollywood and around the world, and it seems safe to say that one of the most prominent themes is vampirism. Vampires are probably the most prevalent screen monsters of recent decades, with zombies as their closest competition. The Mexican film industry made relatively few fantasy films prior to the 1950s, and almost none of these were Hollywood-style horror or monster movies. However, since the late 1950s, vampires have appeared in nearly 4 Mexican films, making them the most popular Mexican movie monster as well. Ironically, in the early 1950s, when Hollywood turned to science fiction, the Mexican film industry began to explore the horror genre. Internacional Cinematográfica produced El Monstruo Resucitado in 1953, La Bruja in 1954, and Ladrón de Cadáveres in 1956, all reasonable facsimiles of Hollywood horror films. However, all three of these movies had Frankenstein-style themes, with a mad doctor using super science to create a monster. El Vampiro, on the other hand, would choose the supernatural route. El Vampiro was the first production of Cinematográfica ABSA, a new company formed by producer-actor Abel Salazar. Salazar began acting in movies in the early 1940s and had produced a handful of films prior to 1957 under various corporate names. For his initial ABSA release, Salazar moved away from the comedies and melodramas with which he was generally associated. In an interview, Salazar later explained, "There was a company that was relatively small compared to others in Hollywood. That was Universal. I asked myself why Universal had made the money it did. It was for their monster movies, their horror films. That was what sustained Universal. Then I decided to make a horror movie, and I chose El Vampiro. I started basically with Dracula, situated on a Mexican hacienda." Salazar hired Fernando Mendez to direct El Vampiro. Mendez, an experienced screenwriter and director, had only made one previous horror film, the recent success Ladrón de Cadáveres. With virtually no previous Mexican models to draw upon, Mendez and screenwriter Ramón Obón were heavily inspired by foreign sources, particularly Hollywood films, setting the pattern for numerous Mexican vampire movies that followed. To provide a marquee name, Salazar took the hero's role himself, with actresses Ariadna Welter and Carmen Montejo in support. But who would play the titular villain, the vampire? Salazar later explained, "I originally signed Carlos López Moctezuma to make El Vampiro. López Moctezuma inevitably had to be López Moctezuma before he was the vampire. I have to find an unknown actor." Carlos López Moctezuma was a well-known character actor who specialized in villainous roles. He and Salazar had worked together several times before, most recently in 1952's Ella, Lucifer y Yo, in which López Moctezuma had played the devil. Now, however, Salazar changed his mind and cast Germán Robles instead. Robles was a 28-year-old Spanish immigrant actor who'd never made a film before. After Germán Robles, other non-Mexican actors who played vampires were Guillermo Muray, Carlos Agosti, John Carradine, and Aldo Monti. The only major male vampires played by Mexican actors prior to 1970 were Fernando Luján in El Pueblo Fantasma and Eric del Castillo in El Imperio de Drácula. El Vampiro went into production in Mexico City in May 1957 at the Clasa Studios. where Cinematográfica Calderón had shot its Aztec Mummy trilogy 2 months earlier. These films were coincidentally written by Abel Salazar's brother Alfredo Salazar, but didn't premiere in the capital until after the release of El Vampiro in the fall. El Vampiro's plot has several glaring holes, but these deficiencies are more than offset by the assured direction of Mendes, the superb photography of Rosalío Solano, and Gunter Gerzo's excellent art direction. The entire film is suffused with an eerie, brooding atmosphere. El Vampiro was released on the 4th of October 1957 and was an immediate success. It was also shown internationally to critical and popular acclaim. American distributor K. Gordon Murray bought El Vampiro, its sequel, and most of Salazar's other horror films, as well as productions from other Mexican companies, and dubbed them into English for theatrical and television release in the United States. A month after the Mexico City premiere of El Vampiro, Salazar reassembled most of the original cast and crew to make a sequel, El ataúd del vampiro, The Vampire's Coffin. Returning were director Mendes, production designer Gerzo, scripter Ramon Abon, and actors Robles, Salazar, Welter, and Alicia Montoya. The Clasa Studios had closed shortly after the filming of El Vampiro, so the sequel was shot at the spacious Churubusco facility instead. Despite a few good scenes, El ataúd del vampiro is significantly inferior to its predecessor. Its best moments are the opening theft of the vampire's coffin from its crypt and the vampire stalking of a young woman through the deserted streets of the city. Most of the action takes place in a hospital and wax museum, far less atmospheric locales than the ruined hacienda of El Vampiro. El ataúd del vampiro was released theatrically in the USA as The Vampire's Coffin by K. Gordon Murray in 1965.
From the depths of evil comes a diabolic killer of beautiful women. The Vampire's Coffin. See a vampire's body stolen from its tomb. A psycho killer removes the stake so the vampire can again prey on beautiful women. It's in the Vampire's Coffin. The Vampire's Coffin. Presented in Hypnoscope. How much shock can you take?
It was also distributed internationally, capitalizing on its predecessor's success. Shortly after finishing El ataúd del vampiro, Germán Robles had a non-speaking guest role as a vampire in the Producciones Sotomayor comedy El castillo de los monstruos, The Castle of the Monsters, with comedian Antonio Espino Clavillazo and leading lady Evangelina Elizondo, as well as clones of some famous Universal monsters. This was also shot at Churubusco in December 1957. After appearing in some non-horror pictures, Robles was signed by the America Studios to appear in a new series about a vampiric descendant of the medieval seer Nostradamus. La Maldición de Nostradamus, Nostradamus el genio de las tinieblas, Nostradamus y el destructor de monstruos, and La Sangre de Nostradamus. All four star Robles as the villain, veteran actor Domingo Soler as his Van Helsing-like nemesis, and Julio Alemán as Soler's assistant. Former actor Federico Curiel directed the entire series, which went before the cameras in August 1959. The Nostradamus films, a bit too talky at times, are nonetheless atmospherically directed and photographed. The low budgets and relatively meager technical resources of the America Studios make the films look rather crude, but this actually works to their advantage in some ways. Robles' character, although a vampire, is actually more of a supervillain. Establishing a reign of superstition and fear, rather than blood drinking, is his primary goal. Nostradamus can change into a bat and has other vampiric traits, but he does very little neck-biting during the whole 4-film series, and is certainly an atypical movie vampire in many ways. Like the Absa horror movies, the Nostradamus films were purchased by K. Gordon Murray, dubbed into English, and shown on television in the USA in the 1960s.
The Genie of Darkness. After numerous attacks by the vampire that end up in the killing of beautiful young women, someone must invent a way to kill vampires. Can science do it? See a scientist invent an ultrasonic method in The Genie of Darkness. See the townspeople turn against the professor and destroy his laboratory. See the professor burned at the stake. See a battle to the death between the professor and the evil forces of the vampire. For an experience that you will never forget, don't miss The Genie of Darkness. The blood of Nostradamus. When the moon is high in the sky, Nostradamus awakes from the dead to spread terror and more terror. To the powers of black magic, no one can resist the blood of Nostradamus. See an evil witch burned alive for challenging the powers of Nostradamus. See horrible monsters who were once strong men before they bartered their souls to Nostradamus. See Nostradamus bring dead bodies back to life through his evil powers. For one blood-curdling experience after another, don't miss the blood of Nostradamus.
Although eternally associated with his most famous role, Germán Robles managed to avoid typecasting. This is not to suggest producers were unwilling to exploit his name and image as the vampire. Robles did not appear at all in El Imperio de Dracula, a color vampire movie made in 1966, but the posters and advertising cribbed his image from El Vampiro, rather than using a photo or artwork of Eric del Castillo, the film's actual vampiric menace. Robles' image continues to crop up in international pop culture, a tribute to the widespread influence of El Vampiro. Germán Robles returned to the vampire genre in 1973 with Los Vampiros de Coyoacán, but this time he plays a sort of Van Helsing role as a vampire-fighting expert brought in to assist masked wrestlers Mil Máscaras and Superzan in combating Baron Braddock, played by Mario Cid. To his credit, Germán Robles, who has had a long and distinguished acting career of more than 60 years, has never disdained his first movie role, perhaps realizing it secured his place in cinema history. And it also began the Mexican cinema of vampires.